Hello and welcome to How Wuthering Waves saved gaming for me. Gaming has always been a big part of my life, but it was the release of one game in particular that absolutely elated me. That was 2012 with the release of Borderlands 2. The feeling of an enjoyable story, fantastic gameplay loop, amazing characters, and even DLC. Nothing since then has quite resonated with me, and that game came out in 2012. Did of course try finding other games, but I love games that allow for skill expression. I played a lot of competitive games such as Rainbow Six Siege, and it was absolutely obliterating my love for gaming. Combine that with the general state of gaming in the last decade, I kind of felt like I'd never enjoy gaming, and that I'd never have an experience like Borderlands 2. That was until I played Wuthering Waves. I was introduced into Wuthering Waves back in September 2024, shortly after the 1.3 update. As someone who does a lot of 3D modeling and animations, the thing that caught my eye when my friend first introduced me to it was the quality of the models, the style, but more importantly the lighting of the world. It looked fantastic and combat looked engaging, so I figured I'd give it a try. Up to this point, my only experience with Gacha games was Genshin Impact, but when it comes to comparisons, I'm mostly going to focus on Borderlands 2. I sat down and didn't really expect anything. I applied the same mindset I do when I go into reading a book, watching a TV show, or watching some anime. I was going to experience the world it had to offer and its story. Firstly, I was surprised that Wuthering Waves did a good job with its tutorial. I generally hate tutorials and think they're a massive waste of time. I'm a fuck around find out type of player for the most part. I prefer the experimentation of things, so right off the bat my impressions were surprisingly good. A good prologue which set up the world, a good enough tutorial, and one of the more important parts for me was the excellent movement it had. Wuthering Waves felt different, and it was the kind of different I have been searching for, well, ever since 2012. This brings me to Spectro Rover. I absolutely love Spectro Rover. For me, in an RPG, I prefer to stick with one character, and if I don't get a choice, then I just stick with the protagonist because that's the intended way of experiencing the game. However, Spectro Rover's moveset was exceptionally phenomenal to me. Well animated, it allows for fast-paced action, swapping between multiple targets, and even an attack based on timing, showcasing a bit of skill required in the starting character of the game. This reminded me of the first time I played Maya in Borderlands 2, a character whose ability and main focus, that being elemental damage and control, resonated deeply with what I want to do in gaming. I also love light magic, so Spectro Rover essentially being a sci-fi light magic user was an immediate pull for me. Although I'm no Donjin main, I also really enjoy the thrill of her playstyle, and how you are always one shot away from obliteration. There are various forms of skill expression, and each character feels more like a build. Building characters and farming items is something I'm very familiar with. Although Wuthering Waves is much more generous in my opinion, because in Borderlands 2 there are items called pearlescence, and some drop rates are like 0.8%. You can grind 10 hours a day for months farming this item and never get it. The amount of perfect Cobra drops that aren't modded in can be counted on one hand. This is similar to rolling Echo substats. The grind for a perfect The Bitch or a perfect Sham Shield is diabolically hard, much like the grind for a perfect Echo substat roll. Let's get back into the building aspect. This is something that I felt was lacking in games that I played. Baldur's Gate 3 briefly revived this for me, but the combat made me feel more disconnected. While I love strategy and tactics in games, I mean, I have over 1,000 hours in Stellaris, which is a grand strategy game, I have this preference of battlefield control and stability in my mind that I want. Borderlands 2 was really the only game that captured the mixture of chaos and control in combat, specifically with Maya. I have played Borderlands 2 since its launch on multiple devices and accounts, specifically just to run around and kill stuff as Maya because the gameplay loop is that enjoyable. Wuthering Waves also has a phenomenal gameplay loop. That said, Wuthering Waves actually does something better than Borderlands 2 does. That's the endgame. Builds, of course, are mostly for the endgame, and that's where the strategy and tactics come in for games like this, to a degree. In Wuthering Waves, the bosses have different movesets, more HP, damage, etc. Some bosses are even dynamic or multi-stage. In Borderlands 2, it's all HP bloat. It is the most lazy and boring form of making a game harder. I often don't do the OP levels in it because it's just HP and number bloat. I tend to stay at the level 80 mark because that's the most fun for me. Wuthering Waves made me love endgame content and even ruined my perception of endgame content in other games as a result. I don't usually do comparisons, but Wuwa and Borderlands 2 are so impactful for me that I can't help but use them as baselines. In Borderlands 2, your builds consist of your skill tree, artifact, grenades, weapons, class mods, and a shield. In Wuthering Waves, your build consists of your weapon, echo sets, upgrading your skill chain, and rotations. Both have their own unique depth, but in Borderlands 2, for the very end game, there are really only like one or two builds for each character that's viable. In Wuthering Waves, I can make Spectral Rover a healer if I wanted to. The expression I have in my characters is fantastic. Sure, it isn't as deep as it could be, but it's deep enough to keep me invested and continuously grinding for it. This brings me into the gameplay. In Borderlands 2, you have your skill, grenade, and weapon, but in WUWA, you have a basic and heavy attack, you have a skill and ultimate, and even a grappling hook. You have combos you can perform as well, counterattacks, and parrying. When it comes to melee combat, a parry system is a must-have for me. However, one of my favorite mechanics in all gaming comes from Wuthering Waves, that being the intro-outro system, and it absolutely changes how you play this game. You can mix and match these skills for basically whatever purpose you want. My favorite intro skill is the Shorekeepers with her guaranteed crit, and my favorite outro is Spectral Rovers with his stasis. Kinda wish it completely stopped time for 3 seconds, but they move so slow it's close enough. The skill expression is much higher, and as a result gets me even more invested than I was. However, gameplay isn't the only thing that I want when it comes to games. I love music, sounds, models, textures, and story as well. Borderlands 2 has a fantastic story, but I will be honest, it has some pretty bad storytelling. Most of the time you are getting exposition or conversations between other characters in your ear while you're just fighting or trying to live. Your player character has no say in anything and just watches stuff go down. Even in the cutscenes, they have no presence, and that was my biggest gripe with Borderlands 2. However, Wuthering Waves delivers on everything that I mentioned earlier, so let's get into that, starting with the sound design and OST. To me, music in a game matters more than even the dialogue does. As long as dialogue is at least decent, but the music matches the tone and scene, it'll elevate it. Sound and music matter a lot when it comes to getting people to feel something. I could use horror movies as an example, but I think Borderlands 2 does this very well. However, it's actually the lack of music that sets the tone for a specific scene. As it's a major spoiler, I will not show it. However, the music in Borderlands 2 kept me engaged, and I just sit there enjoying it and the environment. I have that exact same feeling in Wuthering Waves. However, Wuthering Waves made me appreciate music on a whole different level. Songs like Dianima in the Tethys Depths are fantastic and sound amazing, especially when going through the area for the first time in the main story. However, my favorite song is Astrum Unicum. That's the song that plays in the end of Wandering. I will often open up the game and just sit there listening to the song while writing scripts or doing some modeling or texturing. The locations in Rinasita are also absolutely phenomenal, but I'll get into the world later. We're focused on the music here. The opera-style music we hear in some of the locations, and for some bosses such as Lorelei and her Queen of the Night, are beautifully done, and remind me of my favorite classical artist, that being Mozart. The music during cutscenes is also dynamic as well, changing and fits the tone of each scene. Though again, I am trying to keep things spoiler free until I get to the story side, so with that in mind, let's move on to one of my favorite aspects, that being the art style and design. I typically do not like the stereotypical line art around anime characters in these games. To me, it's usually really distracting. However, for the first time since Borderlands 2, it doesn't feel overwhelming or out of place. It feels authentic and well done, and the transitions between line and no line are also smooth. The quality of the models are exceptionally high, though under some rare circumstances, you can see the polygons making up the models or even the world. These are few and far between, however. The architecture of each area feels unique and like it belongs in the world. The characters, even some of the more outlandish ones, such as Camellia or Encore, feel like they belong in the world they inhabit. My immersion is never broken based on what I'm looking at, and the idea to add a autoplay button was fantastic. I love pressing it and sitting back to watch. I honestly feel like I'm watching an anime at times. One of my main issues, however, was the lack of voice lines from Rover. This was mostly solved in 2.0, however. Speaking of Rover, I feel like Rover fits in incredibly well within the world. Someone who gave themselves amnesia in an attempt to break out of a cycle of non-stop and continuous failure. Someone willing to sacrifice himself to save someone he loves. A person who is deeply attached to humanity and refuses to sacrifice the humanity of mankind just to win is a very compelling and deeply motivating character. While I love characters like Handsome Jack from Borderlands, I oddly enough don't feel like this game needs its own Handsome Jack. As in, a villain so good, they carry the game to incredible heights. Would I object to a Handsome Jack-like character? Of course not. I feel like he could fit in the world, but the design and direction of the characters in the world itself are so well done that each character stands on their own. Speaking of which, let's move on to the writing and story aspects. I will start off by saying that I think the story of Wuwa is a 10 out of 10, though I can also recognize a more objective rating somewhere in the 7 to 8 range. There will be some minor spoilers ahead. The storytelling is phenomenal. Things don't feel like they drag on too long aside from Act 1, but Act 1 feels way shorter than Act 1 in Borderlands 2. I absolutely hate the first place in Borderlands 2 with leveling up from level 1 to 5 being the part I hate the most. It's slow and filled with exposition, but Handsome Jack being constantly present in our ears does help keep me invested and playing until the game picks up, which I'd say would be around when you meet Tiny Tina, much like how the story of Wuthering Waves picks up when you meet Alto and Encore. That said, I actually wasn't invested in the story of Wuwa until Rover woke up on the Black Shores in 1.3. I absolutely loved every single moment of that story. It was genuinely the best experience I had when it came to experiencing a story in a video game. While no villain can ever top Handsome Jack, I think I finally found a character that I enjoy listening to and seeing on screen just as much. The Rover and the Shorekeeper's interactions were unique. I felt like Rover existed more, that they were actually present in the world, and that this amnesia we had served purpose beyond giving developers a reason to info dump stuff at us. Rover felt like he fit into the world perfectly, and the love story between Rover and the Shorekeeper was exceptionally well written and done. Could it have benefited from a bit more time? Sure, but the issues are so minor and small that it feels kind of disingenuous to bring them up. That said, the most important thing for me was Rover being present in the story and being active. In Borderlands 2, we do basically nothing from kill stuff and fight from a story perspective. There is no voice lines outside of standard combat cues. Borderlands 2 is also the main reason why I don't self-insert into characters and into games. It's the same for Wuthering Waves. Rover getting more and more personality, showcasing more and more of his own desires and goals was massive for me. While I can still sit down and enjoy a story where the player character doesn't talk or do much, there is a certain lack of interest that happens. This theme of Rover doing more continued into the 2.0 story, with Rover having a lot more voice dialogue that kept me engaged. Male Rover's voice is nice to listen to, and that's another thing. I don't care about voice acting, to me it's just how a character sounds and it's part of their personality and who they are. My only criticism of the story is basically to give us more of Rover's personality rather than showcasing it in brief cutscenes or small points of dialogue that are quickly forgotten. I shouldn't have to make a lore video on the Rover and who they are for people to understand Rover's motives beyond save humanity and their past. There are some issues I have with the community of Wuthering Waves when it comes to the story, specifically when it comes to everyone loves Rover allegations, which is just false, though I will make a separate video on that later. And now it's time for the biggest critique of the game that I have, and the only reason why I can't put it higher than Borderlands 2. That's the fact it has a gacha mechanic. Wuthering Waves is ultimately a gacha game, so it has a predatory method of obtaining money and relies heavily off of the FOMO marketing tactic. That said, complaining and providing no solution is simply just crying, so here are some ways to improve it and make it less predatory, in my opinion. Remove the 50-50 and just make it guaranteed. Even if the pity has to go up to 90, I still think that's better than a 50-50 system where you can get Ling Yang instead of the limited character. That said, you could also let us sell characters and sequence nodes for asteroids. 4 stars could give us like 5 pulls per sequence node, and the standard banner characters could give us a full 10 pull to help get us back on track. Sure, this only mitigates the problem slightly, but it's better than other systems out there. To be fair though, I do not play a lot of gacha games, so if there are better methods out there, or if you have better ideas, then let me know, and if I get enough comments, I'll make a video discussing the gacha system in ways it could be improved for Wuthering Waves. Wuthering Waves revived in me a feeling I hadn't felt since I was 12 years old with the launch of Borderlands 2. I still remember being at my friend's house, forgetting that I was on the phone with my mom and accidentally sending her a 20-minute voicemail about how excited I was for the game because my friends and I were reacting to the trailers and all the different things that we could see. My love for Wuthering Waves is why I desire more co-op content and even the ability to invite my friends alongside me to experience the story. I finally have a game, again, where music, gameplay, story, world design, and art style all resonate with me, but goes further into the smaller things such as specific playstyles, character traits, and writing directions. While I doubt this game will have a villain quite the same level of Handsome Jack, I have to recognize the reality of the situation I'm in. For the first time in my life, I wanted to play a gacha game, and for the second time in my life, I fell in love with a game. The game isn't perfect, and it certainly has its flaws, but the focus of this video was on what it did for my experience and how it revived gaming for me. If you are interested in hearing about the flaws of the game, then leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed the video, then leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. Until then, I'll see you next time.